Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. It's quite a challenge after the long winter we've had here in Boston to compete with a lovely spring day. And it's great to know that so many of you have decided to be inside rather than outside flying a kite or riding a bike or whatever else you might be doing. And it's particularly apt that you made that choice because I think we have a really fine speaker for you today. My name is Augustus Norton. I'm a professor at Boston University, and I have the honor of chairing the Campagna-Kerven Lecture series, which has been going on since 1996, actually. And we've had, over the years, quite a number of speakers. Today's speaker, who I'll be introducing shortly, is the first to be invited back to give an encore presentation. So this is a new precedent for the lecture series. For those of you who don't know, the lecture series is named in honor of two gentlemen. The first, Gerard Campagna, is an individual who loved books, who loved Turkey, who had a great affection for learning, and who unfortunately is no longer with us. But he is one of the honorees in the title. The other is a gentleman who was an original young Turk who died over 3 decades ago, Campagna-Kerven Lecture, who studied in Paris in the early part of the 20th century, actually wrote a master's thesis at the Sorbonne during that period on the foreign policy of the young Ottomans. While he was in Paris, he met a charming French woman by the first name of Marguerite, and he and Marguerite wed in Paris. And then they moved to Istanbul. They had 2 children, and one of them, his daughter, Suzanne Campagna, is with us today. And the lecture is intended to honor both her husband, Gerard Campagna, and her father. And I think I must say that Suzanne, the lecture series, has done that with some distinction. I'm very proud to be able to say that. When Gerard Campagna left this world, he left a collection of books that was the sort of collection of books that a librarian salivates over, and many of those books are now in the Uyghur Library. And when her father left this world, Mr. Campagna's father also left a love of learning throughout his life. He was a man who dedicated himself to knowledge and understanding of other cultures. So in many respects, this lecture today is particularly apt. Our speaker today is Elif Shafak, who was born in Strasbourg a few decades ago. She is the daughter of a diplomat. Her mother was a diplomat. She has lived on many different continents. She's been here in North America, in Boston, at the University of Arizona as a professor. Now she's living again in Turkey. She truly is a cosmopolitan personality and public intellectual. Her books reveal a fascination and love for mysticism and Sufism, an appreciation of the challenges and the excitement that comes from encountering people from other cultures, people with other ideas, with other traditions. She's one of the few novelists I've known who has been tried for words that one of her characters said. She wrote the novel, which I'm sure many of you have read, The Bastard of Istanbul, which treats with some sensitivity the Armenian history in Turkey. And that was a book that was subject of public accusations against our speaker today, Elif Shafak, for insulting Turkishness. Thankfully, the foolishness of all of that went away, and the case was eventually dismissed. I have a particular affection for her book, Saint of Incipient Insanities. It's the first book I read by our speaker, but I think the reason I enjoy it so much is that it's a wonderful recounting, a fictional recounting of Boston, among other things, including Boston University, and includes both themes of sadness and great happiness and joy as well. Any of her books that you choose to dive into, I think you'll find to be very rewarding. Her most recent book, Black Milk, which is, among other things, a memoir of motherhood and postpartum depression and life in the sort of postmodern world. It's just been published, and we have copies outside for those of you who would like a signed copy. We also have some other books by Elif Shafak for those of you who care to pick up several books. The title of the presentation today is East, West, and Global Souls. And Elif Shafak will speak for about 25 minutes or so, something along these lines. And we'll have plenty of time for questions and comments. We are taping this event. It'll be on the website. We do have a new website, by the way, which was just released today. And in a few weeks' time, or maybe a little bit longer than that, there'll be a streaming video of this presentation. I mention that to you because if you decide to ask a question or make a comment, please wait until you receive a microphone, and that way your words will be preserved for posterity on the web. You won't hear yourself, but the machines will hear you. So thank you very much for coming this afternoon, and please join me in welcoming our first encore speaker, Elif Shafak. Welcome back to Boston.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I'm very honored to be here, very also excited. And to be honest, I'm also curious about your thoughts, your comments, your critical remarks. So I would very much like to turn this into a dialogue. As we were coming here, I asked Professor Norton, and he was kind enough to say it was all right. This is what I'm planning to do. I would like to keep my talk brief, maybe do also a very short reading just to give you a taste of the rhythm, the pace of the writing, and talk about things that matter to me, my writing, a little bit of my background, the way I see, literature, creativity, how I approach. But these will be just perhaps points for discussion, and then just open the ground for, for a dialogue, for a more interactive evening. So please do feel free to share your thoughts, your remarks, your questions with me. Allow me to start with a more personal background. I was born in Strasbourg in 1971. Shortly afterwards, my parents got separated, and I came to Turkey with my mom. And from then on, I was raised by a single mother, which I think has left an impact on my writing, perhaps even on my, personality. At the time, in early 1970s, Ankara was at least the place where we lived, this kind of middle-class neighborhood. It was quite patriarchal, and there were lots of, extended, wide, big families, where definitely fathers were the heads of households. So in this environment, I was raised by a single working mom, and I grew up observing her life and also another woman who was my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. And they were very, very different from one another. My mother's, well-educated, westernized, very modern, very urban, and very rational woman, very independent in her thinking. And I have a lot of respect for that. But also there was my grandmother, who was less educated, much more irrational, if I may use that word, very superstitious, very traditional. And from her, I think I was able, or through her world, I was able to feel more connected with the oral culture in Turkey. And the reason why I'm mentioning these two women, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, I find it quite mesmerizing that in Turkey, like perhaps in several other places in the world, these two very different types of womanhood exist under the same roof, in the same family, and they understand each other, right? Very different in the way they interpret the world, in the way they dress, by the way, okay? In the way they see things, yet at the same time there's amazing love and coexistence. This is what I saw in my micro little environment. And perhaps I grew up thinking this would be possible in a more macro level as well. So at times in Turkey, it pains me to see when, we're very deeply polarized about lots of issues, let's say about religion, about the public space, etc. It pains me to see that the kind of coexistence that I witnessed as I was growing up in my own, little world does not exist at the same level at times in the level of politics. So coexistence is an important concept for me. And another very important notion is empathy. I think empathy very much lies at the core of what we're doing, which is the art of storytelling. For me, telling stories doesn't necessarily mean writing about myself. When I start writing a book, my first urge is not... I don't think that I have something very special to say. I don't think that I have had a very special life and I should share this with people. As a matter of fact, I am not interested in myself at all at that stage. What I'm more interested in is not being myself. Because we're all born into, a certain environment, a certain circle, a certain identity. But through art, when you're producing art, it's always transcendental. You can put yourself in the shoes of other people. If you're a male writer, you can have a female protagonist. You can be a woman when you're writing that story. That kind of transcendental experience, which I think is something that very much fuels empathy, is very central to me. So in other words, when I write stories, I like to impersonate each and every character I'm writing about. This can be side characters, central characters, and try to understand from his point of view, from her point of view, and travel endlessly in time and space. That kind of, the limitless world of imagination is something that attracts me very much. In some ways, I see myself as a commuter, between cultures, and perhaps also a commuter between languages. I do write both in Turkish and English, which is, although it is a bit unusual today, it wasn't that unusual maybe, in late Ottoman era. There were several writers, several poets and writers who would write in more than 2 languages or 3 languages. So it was quite possible. It is possible, of course, when we look at the history of world literature. Although it's a bit unusual in today's contemporary Turkish literary scene, this is something that I enjoy doing, and if you'd like, we can also talk about this, the feeling, the experience of writing in 2 languages. I feel connected to each language in different ways. Perhaps my connection to Turkish language is more emotional. It's the language of my childhood, my grandmother, and I feel a very deep, strong attachment to this language. And yet at the same time, the English language with its vocabulary, with its the precision of the words, the subtleties, it mesmerizes me, it excites me, and I like to lose myself in that labyrinth. So perhaps it's a more cerebral attachment, if you will. And I believe in this age we can talk about this perhaps more freely and understand each other better than ever, because this is the age of migrations, of movements, of renewals. We keep reconstructing ourselves as we travel, and this is the age of, in many ways, nomadic existences and global souls. I do believe there are 2 very opposite tendencies in today's world. On the one hand, as I said, it is, all these migrations, cultural encounters are becoming more and more widespread, and there are more and more global souls. So this is one side of the picture. On the other hand, however, and paradoxically, we are also perhaps becoming in some ways more and more insular, because we live in our own cultural ghettos, mental ghettos, and although this is the age of cultural encounters, it is also the age of cultural misunderstandings. And I think we keep misunderstanding each other a lot. So within that framework, I believe as artists, as storytellers, perhaps we could bring those elements together, those elements that might seem to be very different at first glance, and see the synthesis, see the energy that comes out of that. For me, that cosmopolitan energy is very important. And perhaps that's one reason why in my books you see all these different characters coming from different cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds. This is something that I feel strongly about. And yet at the same time, in the world of literary fiction or literature, there is this expectation that, you know, you should have an identity attached to your work, and that the expectation that that identity should define the content of your work. So, for instance, if you're an, let's say, Algerian women writer, then the general expectation is you should be writing about the problems of being, you know, a woman in Algeria, which is fine. You can do that in one book, but maybe in another book you're going to write about something completely different. So that kind of freedom of mobility is sometimes hard to encounter, because there is too much identity of politics, I believe, in the world of art and literature as well. And should you like, we can also talk about this. But I guess coming back to, you know, where I started with my mother and grandmother, what I'm trying to say is, from one, I learned the love of written culture. And I grew up reading Russian literature, basically French literature, and as I grew up, English literature. And from the other side, oral culture, the Middle Eastern storytelling, you know, techniques. These are things that I cherish, and perhaps I believe in a fusion, in a synthesis, in a hybridity of, you know, that's obtained by bringing them together. I strongly feel that in this world, if we're ever going to learn anything, we will be learning it from people who are different than us, not who are exactly like us. Just the opposite. If we are only surrounded by people who do think like us, who dress like us, who come from similar backgrounds, that would be a very narcissistic existence, because it means we are only looking at our own mirror images. So those encounters between different people who have challenging ideas, I'm not romanticizing it. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it creates its own, you know, tensions and conflicts. But nonetheless, I believe there's a lot of potential there for art, for literature, but also for humanity, because we do learn from each other. And it seems important to me not to lose those cultural contacts. As I said, you know, commuting between cultures in some ways perhaps makes me more aware of these elements. And yet at the same time, there is a metaphor actually used by Rumi that explains maybe my approach better. He talks about living this life as a drawing compass. He uses it in another context, but I like to think about that metaphor. As you know, one leg of the drawing compass is quite static. It is based in one location. Meanwhile, the other leg draws a huge wide circle around it and is constantly traveling. Just like that, I like to believe, I like to think that one leg of my fiction, of my storytelling, is strongly rooted in Istanbul, in Turkish culture, in my grandmother's oral culture, and it's continuously learning from that source. And yet at the same time, the other leg, in the meantime, is constantly traveling around the world as best as I can, as much as I can, and feeling connected to different cultures and cities and going back and forth. So being both local and universal, being both from here and everywhere, I think it's possible, and it is possible in this age more than ever before. That is why, you know, abandoning those more narrow-minded definitions of identity politics and trying to find those global connections that will, in my opinion, facilitate our understanding of each other. Following that path seems a better route, or is closer to my heart. As a writer, the first and foremost thing that I like to think about myself is just a storyteller, you know, without any identities or labels attached to it. We always talk about women writer or young woman writer, or sometimes Middle Eastern writer, Turkish writer, this and that. There are lots of words we attach, and certainly they are important. But at the end of the day, I think it's only a storyteller or a writer that is the main emphasis for me. And in Turkey, particularly in my book signings, when I look at the people waiting in line, I realize they're very different, from one another. There are women who are covered. There are women who are very feminist. There are people who are very leftist, liberals, mystics, waiting in the same line to get their books signed. And it intrigues me because these are people who do not normally talk to one another, who don't share bread together. But the very fact that they're reading the same book, the very fact that they're reading the same novel, this is something that makes me happy. And I don't want art or literature to lose that potential of bringing people together, connecting people together. So for me, I talked about empathy, but just equally important is the word connections. I believe at the end of the day, all art, particularly the art of storytelling, is about connections, building connections. When you're writing a novel, you write about different characters, but you constantly show how the lives of these characters affect one another, right? It's all about connections. And this is how we see the world. We are all interconnected. And I believe in this age, particularly after 9/11, we don't have the luxury of not seeing this anymore. We were always interconnected as human beings, but today more than ever, because this is the age in which the unhappiness of somebody living in Pakistan affects the life of someone living, in Amsterdam or in Canada. Our stories, our fates, our happinesses and unhappinesses are always interconnected. So connections are very important for me as well as a writer. Should you like, I can stop here, and with your questions, with your comments, please feel free. We can talk about the 40 Rules of Love, Black Milk, the earlier books, or about more general themes as well. I'm very open to your questions. Thank you.
Would like to begin this afternoon.
You said you would read something. Can you do that?
Yes, of course, I will. Yes. So this is from the novel The 40 Rules of Love. This one just came out. Well, it came out in Turkey first. However, it was written in English first. And then it was translated into Turkish, and I took the Turkish translation and I rewrote it in a way. And those of you who are familiar with the book would know this, but it takes place in two different time zones. On the one hand, there's a contemporary love story evolving between a Jewish American housewife, actually living in Boston, and then there's a modern-day Sufi living in Amsterdam. And as she reads his book, she discovers this other world, a more spiritual world, a more spiritual love story that takes place in the 13th century, and that is the story of Rumi and Shams of Tabriz. So as I was writing this book, I wanted to give each character, their first-person voices, not only Rumi and Shams of Tabriz, who were historical figures, of course, historical people, real people, but also more imaginary side characters. So there's, for instance, a beggar living in Konya in the 13th century, or a prostitute living at that time, or a drunk man. So these seemingly ordinary characters, and bringing them into the picture was important to me, as well as writing about these, important historical characters. That's why everyone's voice in the book is in the first person. And as the story evolves, you see it through their eyes, and the reality keeps changing and changing. This is a technique that I cherish a lot. As a writer, I do not believe in teaching anyone anything, or having one message and then trying to convey that message to the reader. Instead, what I like is to have multiple characters saying different things, multiple levels, multiple voices, and within that orchestra of voices, I like to leave it to the reader to follow her own path. So usually in my books there are multiple layers, and as I said, multiple voices. So the part that I will be reading is Rumi's voice in the book, and the year is 1245 in Konya. So he's talking about his love for Shams of Tabriz. Bountiful is your life, full and complete. Or so you think, until someone comes along and makes you realize what you have been missing all this time. Like a mirror that reflects what is absent rather than present, he shows you the void in your soul, the void you have resisted seeing. That person can be a lover, a friend, or a spiritual master. Sometimes it can be a child to look after. What matters is to find the soul that will complete yours. All the prophets have given the same advice. Find the one who will be your mirror. For me, that mirror is Shams of Tabriz. Until he came and forced me to look deep into the crannies of my soul, I had not faced the fundamental truth about myself, that though successful and prosperous outside, I was lonely and unfulfilled inside. It is as if, for years on end, you compile a personal dictionary. In it, you give your definition of every little concept that matters to you, such as truth, happiness, or beauty. At every major turning point in life, you refer to this dictionary, hardly ever feeling the need to question its premises. Then, one day, a stranger comes and takes your precious dictionary and throws it away. All your definitions need to be redefined, he says. It is time for you to unlearn everything you know. And you, for some reason, unbeknownst to your mind, but obvious to your heart, instead of raising objections or getting cross with him, gladly comply. This is what Shams has done to me. Our friendship has taught me so much. But more than that, he has taught me to unlearn everything I knew. When you love someone this much, you expect everyone around you to feel the same way, sharing your joy and euphoria. And when that doesn't happen, you feel surprised, then offended and betrayed. How could I possibly make my family and friends see what I see? How could I describe the indescribable? Shams is my sea of mercy and grace. He is my son of truth and faith. I call him the King of Kings of Spirit. He is my fountain of life and my tall cypress tree, majestic and evergreen. His companionship is like the fourth reading of the Quran, a journey that can only be experienced from within but never grasped from the outside. Unfortunately, most people make their evaluations based on images and hearsay. To them, Shams is an eccentric dervish. They think he behaves strangely and speaks blasphemy, that he is utterly unpredictable and unreliable. To me, however, he is the epitome of love that moves the whole universe, at times retreating into the background and holding every piece together, at times exploding in bursts. An encounter of this kind happens once in a lifetime, once in every 38 years. Ever since Shams came into our lives, people have been asking me what it is in him that I find so special, but there's no way I can answer them. At the end of the day, those who ask this question are the ones who won't understand it, and as for those who do understand, they don't ask such things. The quandary I find myself in reminds me of the story of Layla and Harun al-Rashid, the famous Abbasid emperor. Upon hearing that a Bedouin poet named Qais had fallen hopelessly in love with Layla and lost his mind for her, and was therefore named Mejnun, the madman, the emperor became very curious about the woman who had caused such misery. This Layla must be a very special creature, he thought, a woman far superior to all other women. Perhaps she's an enchantress, unequaled in beauty and charm. Excited, intrigued, he played every trick in the book to find a way to see Layla with his own eyes. Finally, one day, they brought Layla to the emperor's palace. When she took off her veil, Harun al-Rashid was disillusioned. Not that Layla was ugly or old, but she wasn't extraordinarily attractive either. She was a human being with ordinary human needs and several flaws, a simple woman like countless others. The emperor did not hide his disappointment. Are you the one Mejnun has been crazy about? Why, you look so ordinary. What is so special about you? Layla broke into a smile. Yes, I am Layla, she said. But you see, you are not Mejnun. You have to see me with the eyes of Mejnun. Otherwise, you could never solve this mystery called love. How can I explain the same mystery to my family, friends, or students? How can I make them understand that for them to grasp what is so special about Shams of Tabriz. They have to start looking at him with the eyes of Mecnun. So that's just a taste, just a little vignette, the voice of Rumi in the book. Would you like to continue with questions?
I would like to begin to get things
Please.
going. When one talks to Turks these days from Istanbul, Ankara, at least from the major cities, one hears lots of discussion about the polarization of society and the animosities in contemporary Turkish society. And I think for many of these people, to use your metaphor of the dictionary, it's as if the dictionary they've been using all of these years doesn't work anymore. They can't find the words they need to understand the kind of Turkey they're living in. So I wonder if you could reflect a bit on the changes taking place in Turkey and the extent to which, in your own view, the polarities, the animosities, the cleavages are being widened or in some cases are being bridged? And if so, how is that happening?
Thank you. I think it's an important question, and perhaps it's a question that we also ask ourselves, from time to time. Now, I believe Turkey is a mesmerizing country. It's so very different and so unique in so many ways. So it's not easy to put it into any single category, particularly if we're using more traditional categories like East and West and so on. It just doesn't fit very easily into any single category or into any single cliche. It is a mesmerizingly multi-layered society, complex society, and also I think it is not only a very young society. I mean, when you look at the percentage of the young people, of the young population, it's very wide, but not only a very young society, at the same time it's a very fast-moving society. And this is one of the things that adds to its complexity. I mean, from one week to another, you will see the mood changes. Sometimes the mood in the media changes. So depending on which particular time we are talking about, we might get a different picture. Also, when you go to Turkey today, depending on whom you talk to, you might hear different answers. And I believe it is the sum total of all those voices that makes Turkey. So the people who are critical of the government, the people who are in favor of the government, all of their voices should be added into the picture in order to understand the country much better. The problem is usually in political analysis, in my opinion, experts, they focus on politics solely, or politicians. Now, Turkish politics is very male-dominated. The parliament and the discourse there is a bit more contentious, I would say. However, when you look at the society is not exactly the same. And in my opinion, in the society, there are many more syntheses, there are many more hybridities. The kind of coexistence that I was telling you at the beginning of my talk, my mother and my grandmother, it exists everywhere. So it is a society that in many ways has developed the art of coexistence. And I believe it is important to look not solely at politics, but culture, daily life, women's lives. These things always escape our attention. We don't just, particularly in academic work or in the world of media, then we don't pay them enough attention. But as a writer, I think we should pay more attention to that side. So it's a very fast-moving society. At the same time, certainly, I mean, Turkish democracy has its own flaws. When it comes to freedom of speech, there are several things that we need to be more mature about. Nonetheless, it is a democracy, and it is a mesmerizing example in which a country in which most of the population is Muslim has developed its own secular regime, its own secular way of life. So it makes me sad that its uniqueness sometimes is not appreciated enough. When people look at it from the outside, because it's always the conflicts that are making the headlines. But at the same time, there's an amazing coexistence in Turkey. it is going through many, many transformations, and I think, there's an upcoming elections now. Perhaps after the elections there will be a new constitution. Many people are talking about a new constitution, a more, democratic constitution. But I have a lot of faith in Turkey, particularly in the young people in Turkey, and also women in Turkey. I think women are very open to change, very critical-minded, and women are very visible in many areas, like academia. When you look at universities, the percentage of women in Turkey, particularly at the level of faculty, not only students, it is sometimes much higher than several continental European countries. And then art, literature, advertisement, media. Women are very vocal and very visible. The only place where you can't see women in the same way is Turkish politics, in the parliament. The parliament is, again, the percentages need to change. It is changing, but very slowly. It's not fast enough. So depending on which area we concentrate on, again, we will get a different picture. But as I said, certainly we should be able to criticize ourselves as well. I think every society moves forward by its ability to criticize itself. In that sense, self-criticism is a healthy thing. It is healthy for individuals. It's healthy for also societies. We should be more comfortable about that. But that said, I have also amazing faith in Turkey's richness, its culture, and its ability to change forward and to move forward. As I said, it's an amazingly dynamic society. And if I may add something else, the questions that Turkey is asking herself, about how to reconcile or juxtapose its Eastern elements with its Western elements, how to be part of EU, how to bring together your own perhaps religious heritage with your secular political system. All those questions, I think, are also important for the world in general, particularly after 9/11. So it's not only Turkey's questions or not only regional questions, I would say, but worldwide as well. I think Turkey is an important example, and I wish it should be given more space in political analysis and world coverage. Thank you.
Richard? Elif, thank you. That was very inspiring. I want to continue on the theme of politics. We're kind of obsessed with that here. But politics of language.
Okay.
So I remember once, some years ago, excuse me if I misparaphrase you, but you said to me something about that it's impossible to be just a novelist in Turkey, that you are always expected to represent some political view, some national view, and you have suffered for that, the court case, but also I remember newspaper articles attacking you because you wrote in English. What kind of a Turk writes in English and has them translated? So there, my one part of the question is, has any of that changed and why? But the other part of the question is, even though you don't see the use of language in literature as a political act, I do remember seeing something, perhaps in an interview some years ago again, where you said, I think, something about trying to resurrect Ottoman Turkish because it is so much richer, and that the new Turkish that was developed in the Republic, got rid of a lot of that rich variety of terminology, and that you were trying to do that. And of course, the media reaction in Turkey was to call you an Islamist. So I wondered if you could just address what your thoughts are about that. I mean, you may or may not think of that as political, but certainly other people do.
Thank you. I appreciate. I think, of course, one of the problems maybe we all experience is nuances are lost so easily. Like, you might be a spiritual person. In some ways, I do see myself as someone who's interested in mysticism, in spiritual thought. But that doesn't mean you're religious at all. They're very different things, being religious and spiritual. So we can lump together everything in just one little basket. We can very easily attach labels to people without knowing those peoples. Unfortunately, we are also capable of making sweeping generalizations about one another. And that produces fear, of course, fear of the other. We always fear the people we don't know, well enough, right? But this is not only Turkey's problems, I believe. It's a worldwide problem. It exists everywhere. That kind of othernization. It does exist everywhere. Now, let me go back to your first question. Yes, in Turkey, it's sometimes a bit hard to be only a novelist, because it's quite interesting, actually, because novelists are in some ways public figures, right? And this was the case from late Ottoman era onwards. Novelists have played some role in modernizing the country as public intellectuals. And many novelists wrote as father novelists because they wanted to teach something to their readers. And to this end, they have kept the language a bit simple so that their messages would be conveyed more clearly. But I don't see myself close to that literary tradition. For me, language is as important as content. I'm very passionate about language. I love the alphabet. I know it sounds very simple, but that is the truth. To me, it seems like magic, obtaining endless meanings by changing the place of letters, playing with words. It doesn't matter in Turkish, in Ottoman, in English. Just the pure alphabet itself is a passion of mine. So I'm interested in language. I'm interested in developing myself in terms of expanding my horizons, in language. Yes, I do write. When I write in Turkish, there are lots of old Ottoman words, Sufi words. I like to not necessarily bring back, because many of them do exist, of course, in the society, but the nuances are important to me. I'm interested in that mystical language as well, and I like to combine that with more modern, contemporary, daily Turkish. So my vocabulary is richer. Some people criticize that. They think it's just a backward thing to use old words. But I believe words live longer than we do. So, their lifespan is longer than our lifespan. And we should let them live, let them continue. And for us writers, those nuances are very important, It's not the same thing. I mean, sometimes I like to use modern words. Sometimes I like to use old words. And I shouldn't be in a position to make a choice. They can all be part of the narrative. So I like to approach it in a more flexible way. Writing in English, some people have criticized it, but also many people are embracing it and understanding it. As I said, it's a very young society. It's a society in which, Facebook users are like maybe the third in the world. It's a society that tweets a lot, uses Facebook a lot. The young people in Turkey are very well connected with the world, and they are very curious about the world, and that, of course, accelerates its pace. There's always criticism, when in anything, perhaps everything we do in life. But for me, what really matters is, rather than looking at the person, rather than talking about the writer, I think we should be talking about the writing, the books. What we really need is literary criticism, and that's the least we get. We don't need personal criticism, because that doesn't help. But a criticism of our work, in terms of its content, in terms of its style, that's really helpful, that's really constructive. I'm open to that kind of criticism very much. But if I may add one more thing, although sometimes there are, all kinds of people, all kinds of writings, I have to say, Turkish readers, and by that I mostly mean women readers, are amazing in their feedback, in their warmth, and in the positive energy you get from there. And that's sometimes that, we can forget about, because they're not in the picture, they're more invisible, But I think there's an amazing inspiration coming from the readers. Not as much from the elite, perhaps, but from the readers. And I think they're great. Yeah.
Thank you.
That was exactly tuning in with the question that I wanted to ask you about your readers, and especially your readers in Turkey. I find it fascinating what you tell us about how you are merging, blending all these different identities, if you can call them identities at all. And I would be interested to learn, what's your sense of how your readers in Turkey are picking that up or not picking up? How are they responding to your books? What kind of conversations have you been having? Well, I would be interested in both the positive and the negative, if you would love to
Absolutely.
share that. So
Yeah,
thank you.
I'll try to give glimpses of both the positive and the negative. I do get a lot of emails, letters, and usually when I'm in Turkey, I do lots of events in different cities, travel, and I like to listen to people. I honestly think every writer needs to be a good listener, first and foremost. So I like to listen to two things. First, what people are telling me, and also how they are expressing it, the energy with which that comes out. So I listen to people a lot. And again, because novelists are seen as more than novelists, people share their personal stories with us. I don't know how that happens. I've really never seen anything like that anywhere else. But they tell you about their family stories, their secrets. Sometimes I have male readers telling me about their girlfriends, about their problems with their girlfriends. I have people, getting married and reading passages from Aşk, for instance, from the 40 Rules of Love. So they're very moving things, and that comes from below, from the people, it's, one thing that draws my attention in my book signings. Sometimes people bring books, and I realize maybe 5 or 6 people in the same family have read the same novel, underlining different sentences by using different colored pens. That never happens here. It doesn't happen usually in other places, because a novel is your individual belonging, right? But there, you read it, you give it to your aunt. Your aunt likes it very much, gives it to her friend. Her friend sends it to her cousin in Germany, and the cousin in Germany sends it back, and 6 people read the same book, underlining different passages with different colored crayons. So it is, people share it. That's what I'm trying to say. And if they embrace you as a storyteller, then you're part of their family. That's why you're entitled to know their family stories. There's an amazing interaction with the readers. Most fiction readers are women, overwhelmingly women of very different age groups, from very different walks of life. As I said, some of them are covered, some of them are religious, some of them are conservative, some of them support the government, some of them very critical of the government, very strictly, some of them Kemalist. They define themselves in very different ways. But there is an amazing flexibility in their gaze when they're reading the book, when they're reading a novel. At the end of the day, everybody's reading is unique, is very different from one another's. But that kind of bonding is, I think, very special to me. And as I said, it's something that inspires me a lot. Now, about the criticism, just to give you an idea, when this book came out in Turkey, it had a very pink cover, but very clearly pink, boldly pink cover. And there was a heart on it. It was a very simple cover. But in fact, I worked with a female photographer. I like her work a lot. And her approach is a little bit mystical as well. She lives in Istanbul. In fact, it's not the picture of a heart. It's the X-ray of a leaf of a tree. And the idea is, we are surrounded by all these simple things in our lives, but we don't pay too much attention to them. You just walk by. We don't look at a leaf because it's an ordinary object or it's an ordinary thing, right? But if we pay closer attention, there's a heart in it. So it very much matched the content, the Sufi content of the story. It's a very modest, very simple book jacket, but at the same time, it's not in harmony with the story. So this book came out in a very pink way. To be honest, I was not very comfortable with, pink before, but when you become a mother, when you have a daughter, pink starts to rule the house. So, I started to have a more positive view of the color. And I said, okay, let's go for it. Now, when the book came out in Turkey, I started receiving an amazing criticism from male readers. Most of them with all the good intentions, but sending me emails, some of them calling the publishing house. There were so many phone calls. Some of them are recorded. They're very funny. Saying, and these are from young Turkish male readers, not older generation, which I find very interesting, saying, okay, we bought the book, but we can't read it because we can't carry it with us in the public space. Because it's so pink, you know, on the ferry boat or the bus. And I realized people started to cover it with, you know, newspapers and, you know, as if there's... So this went on for 5 months, and at the end we printed another edition. This one's smoky gray, very serious looking, for people who are not very comfortable with pink. Now, of course, there was a lot of, you know, many columnists wrote many things about it. Some of them criticized me. They thought this was, you know, for publicity or other things. But that's okay. All I'm saying is it's a very dynamic and amazingly fast-growing world, the world of literature. The only, perhaps, thing that sometimes makes it heavier for me is, as we talked earlier, sometimes there's too much focus on the individual. You know, that's the part that makes it heavier, because we want them to focus on our works. But other than that, it's a very receptive, interactive readership, the one that I see in Turkey.
It's become easier to bring up issues related to the genocide, Armenian genocide, or issues related to the Armenian problem in general now than it was before, or is it still very much taboo?
I think Turkey, you know, in the last 10 years has been talking about so many issues so openly. You know, when you look at the Turkish press today, and I think that's one of the healthiest things about Turkish media. Even in the same newspaper, you will find people with very different opinions. You know, when you open these 2 pages, just one columnist here, one columnist here, telling completely different things, which I find very healthy, both for the media and for the democracy in general. Many people have been, you know, talking about identity issues, not only with regards to Armenian, you know, minorities or Greek minorities, Jewish minorities, but also today in relation to Kurdish, you know, identity. And things that were not very openly talked about earlier on, you know, much earlier, are now talked openly in the society. So I believe there's an amazing change in that regard. And it is, as I said, a very, very fast-moving society. And the Turkish media is really amazingly multivocal. I mean, from the very left of the left to the very right of the right. There's a huge wide range of papers and newspapers. We sometimes forget that, you know, because in the West only a few newspapers are known, but there's an amazing range of voices, not only printed media, but also TVs and also online. So it is a very multivocal, very heterogeneous society, and I believe many people are talking about lots of issues openly.
What drives you to write?
What drives me to write? Thank you. That's a beautiful question. And it's a hard question to answer in some ways. I started writing at an early age. I was like 8 years old when I started writing. And from then on, in a way, I never stopped, except for the time of this, you know, duration of that postpartum depression. I never stopped writing, but not because I didn't start writing because I wanted to be a novelist or, you know, I had such aspirations. I had no idea. I didn't even know there was such a possibility for me, you know. All I wanted, all I needed was stories to make my life colorful, because the life I was living was very dull. It was very lonely. As I said, I was raised by a working mom, and so she was away for many hours. And I was on my own. And when we were in Spain, later on in Amman, you know, there's maybe a sense of cultural alienation that's added to that sense of loneliness. So books were the best thing in my life. You know, they were my best friends. And I started writing diaries, but the diaries were full of, in some ways, fiction. Because normally what you would write in a diary is you would say, you know, whatever happened in that day, you would put it down, right? Whereas I was writing about people who didn't really exist and things that never really happened. So from diaries to short stories, it was a very short step, and then into novels. It keeps my pieces together. You know, in many ways, I think we all are like that. I think a human being is a very fragmented, is the sum total of fragmented layers, perhaps. We have different selves in us, different voices in us, different aspirations. I experienced that very much when I was writing Black Milk. There are 6 little women in that book. They're bickering constantly, quarreling constantly, and each trying to pull me in different ways. Writing is the only glue that keeps all those pieces together. And over the years, I've started thinking it's the only suitcase I can take with me wherever I go. So I think all of that just keeps you writing. But the basic urge for me, the main urge, was not to become a novelist. I needed stories. So that need is still very much with me today. It has never disappeared. Please. Oh, thank you.
You spoke about the relationships you had with your grandmother and your mother growing up, and the transcultural connections you had in your own household. And you mentioned how it saddens you to see a difference in that upbringing in Turkey, namely Istanbul today. What do you think is the hindrance of those relationships now as opposed to when you were growing up?
When you say hindrance, can you tell me a bit more?
What has changed from when you were younger to now in Turkey that is causing a much less multicultural relationship?
I see. You know, what has changed in Turkey from 1970s to this day? Lots of things have changed. Of course, we have gone through 3 military takeovers. Sometimes it's, you know, one forgets because the human memory doesn't maybe remember all these long historical processes. But it wasn't that far away, 1970s, 1980, right? And before that, 1960. So 3 military takeovers. Now we have, I believe, we have come to such a stage in which military takeover is not a possibility anymore. People have understood, people of all ideologies have understood maybe to cherish democracy, to understand how valuable it is. And I think in that sense, Turkey has made a huge progress. In many ways, in the past, we used to think the army was the guarantor of democracy. The people don't approach it like that anymore. And they have understood, particularly the young people have understood that democracy is only possible if we as individuals take part in it and feel, you know, passionate about it, you know, care about it. So there's more awareness, I would say, in that sense, very much so. At the same time, yes, there is a polarization because the party in power today is coming from a different background than the traditional elite we are used to. So in that sense, the political elite in Turkey has changed. But that doesn't mean the society has lost its ability to coexist. So in my opinion, there's an amazing coexistence at the level of the society. But the biggest changes have, of course, occurred at the level of both the role of the military changing, the development of democracy, being more connected with the world, you know, because now we know that we're not an insular society, we're not away, disconnected, and just the opposite. There's this sense that we can be an important player in the world. There's that kind of awareness. I mean, these are things that I observe when I listen to people. So people are feeling more attached to the world, not only to the world as an abstract notion, to the Balkans, Russia, the Middle East. They're more interested, curious about what's going on. Many people think in Turkey, especially young people, you know, when I look at what the things they're writing online, when all those movements were taking place in Egypt, Libya, you know, one after another, Syria now, many people among Turkish youth were saying maybe they would like to look at Turkey as an example. You know, there was that kind of expectation. So there's more self-confidence, I think, now. All of that is there. But as I said, the biggest change has been in that sense, the political elite, the nature of the political elite in Turkey has changed visibly. Yeah.
To shift from political again to your craft, to writing, I was reminded by a book by the Israeli author David Grossman, who reflects on his writing somewhat along the lines that you were just doing so wonderfully and so richly. And one chapter in that book is entitled "The Books That Read Me." And in that, he talks about 2 or 3 books that had a profound influence, not so much in his craft of writing, but in his very conception of writing and who he is. So if you were to engage in that kind of reflection, what would be 2 or 3 books that read you, so to speak?
That's such a beautiful question. Thank you. There are so many. I'm a curious reader. Maybe I have a very eclectic reading list, if I may put it that way. You know, from very different sources. I read Don Quixote at an early age. Then again. I'm still reading it. It has a huge impact. You know, the kind of imagination, the layers. Also, when I was in Spain as a child, it's left a big impact on me. I've always loved Russian literature, and several Russian authors have left a big impact. The Mesnevi, Rumi's Mesnevi, with all the volumes. The Mesnevi is not a book that we can read just once from the beginning till the end, but perhaps it's a book, you know, you read just one vignette today, tomorrow you read another vignette, the other day you start from the last page and go backwards. It has multiple doors, multiple entrances. Definitely Rumi, and Rumi's poetry in general inspires me very much. There are so many women writers. You know, in Black Milk, I mentioned some of those women writers, from Zelda Fitzgerald, very different women writers from, you know, different literary trends, like Halide Edip Adıvar in Turkey. I think she was a mesmerizing personality. She was, by the way, writing in English and in Turkish at her time. In 1940s, she was writing in both languages. So there are all these amazing women with their personalities, with their writing, that are constantly, I think, inspiring me. That said, I read different books for completely different reasons. Sometimes because I like the style, sometimes because I'm intrigued by the story, sometimes because I'm curious about the writer. So for very different reasons. But I am an avid reader. I try to, you know, not to lose that, because that's our source. We get our inspiration from there. It's, of course, interesting. As Turkish writers, many of us grow up learning more about, you know, French literature, English literature, Russian literature. We read European literature more than Europeans read us. In the West, Turkish literature is not very well known, but we follow Western literature very closely.
Elif, I appreciate your comments very much about mysticism and Sufism and so forth, and human rights. And I was just wondering, you knew Hrant Dink, and I was wondering what effect, if any, Hrant Dink had on your life, because needless to say, it was a very big thing in Turkey when his death occurred.
Thank you. Yes, I knew him personally. I think he was a very special person. He was someone who had a lot of love in his heart, and he was someone who believed in the ability of people from different religions, different ethnicities, living together in peace. I think he was someone who loved Turkey so very, very much. He loved Turkey, Anatolia very much, and Turkish culture very much. He loved Istanbul very much. He was a very friendly person, you know, and his heart and his mind was very much open. And I think many people in Turkey, it's very interesting. These people can be leftists, conservatives, from Kurds, Turks, appreciate that side of him and are trying to understand him better. So it's not only the negative coverage that we have seen in the past that doesn't characterize the approach of the whole media. There are many very positive articles about Hrant Dink appearing still to this day as we're speaking. I'm reading different columnists writing about him, and I think his funeral was amazing. You know, it brought together thousands and maybe millions of people. Felt so sad, so much grief, but at the same time there was an amazing feeling of solidarity and friendship. I've never seen anything like that before. So in his death, I think he brought people together as well.
We have one question over here. Yes.
Just a very small question. Do you read all these books in the original language?
Oh, I wish I could read in the original language. I only read in English and in Turkish. I do read a little bit of Spanish, so that's it. I wish I could read Rumi in Farsi, for instance. Definitely it would have been a treasure in that sense. Or I wish I could read Russian literature in Russian. That would have been a treasure. But nonetheless, for instance, if we're talking about Sufism, there's an amazing bulk of literature in the English language. I'm mesmerized by that. Very precious scholars, very important scholars like William Chittick, Anne-Marie Schimmel in Germany, she was like that. So in the English language, I mean, even though we're talking about subjects, we might be talking about subjects related to the East, there's an amazing literature here in America or in the English language. So I try to follow both in Turkish and English as best as I can. Please.
Perhaps one final question. When you write a book in English and then have it translated into Turkish, why don't you translate it yourself? And could you reflect a little bit on the difficulty of taking that language of precision and complexity, English, and translating it into Turkish?
Thank you. I do not translate my work into English or into Turkish, or vice versa, for two reasons. First of all, I cannot do it. I don't have the talent. I think translation is a completely different zone of creativity. I have a lot of respect for, I've learned a lot from the translators I worked with closely. It's an amazing talent. It's not enough to know one language or two language well enough. That's not enough to because there's a separate way of thinking. And it's a pity because oftentimes we don't recognize how important translators are. We depend so much on them. I believe they recreate the book. And sometimes even it's better than the original. So we owe them a lot. But they're always in the background. They're not very well recognized in that sense. Now, the second reason why I'm not translating it myself is because I would have changed it so much. Somebody needs to control me. If I start writing this book today, I would write a completely different book. So it's good to stay within those, within that framework. As I go back and forth between languages, I'm mesmerized. I pay attention to those words that cannot be translated from one language to another, as much as I pay attention to those that can be. I think it was Salman Rushdie who said, if you want to know a culture better, you have to look at the concepts that cannot be directly translated. It gives us an idea, about the culture, the surrounding society. So it's not only a matter of grammar and vocabulary, but also paying more attention to culture. It also intrigues me to see, maybe you would agree with me, but when we shift from one language to another, our voices change, our intonation changes. I think we change. We start using different parts of our brain because language has an effect on us. Every language shapes us. We're not shaping language. I have, it's an example I like to give, but it's so true. I've seen many Turkish women who are, brought up as very, of course, modest ladies. I've never heard them swear in Turkish, never, but I've heard them swear in English. And I'm intrigued, how does that happen? When you're speaking English, it's as if you're a different person and it's okay to swear. It gives you an additional zone of existence. So languages, every language has its own additional layers. I like to chase that. I like to take a closer look at that, but I cannot make the translation myself, do the translation myself. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I very much want to thank our speaker today, Elif Shafak, for reappearing at the castle. And she's been on a journey of literature and writing since she was 8 years old. So it would be interesting to see where she is 10 or 12 years from now, what paths and highways she's meandered down, and which paths she's doubled back on, and so on. And maybe we'll have a chance to see that. In the meantime, I invite all of you who would like to have one of her books to go out in the lobby and pick one up. And I'm sure that Elif will be happy to sign them. And we'll also be having a reception to which, of course, everyone is invited. So please enjoy yourself, and thank you again for coming this afternoon. Thank you.